Hi, everyone. Give you a second here, give people a second to join on. So last year when I did this, in the middle of my presentation, the Wi-Fi or the power went out. So hopefully we won't have that issue this time. So I'm coming to you from a town called Patos de Minas in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. It's considered the southeast part of Brazil. So it's a large town, but it's, for the most part, just a regular run-of-the-mill agricultural community here. So I think we'll get started here, and as people join us, and as we move along, if you have any questions, just feel free to type those in. There's a Q&A box there, and I probably won't get to them until the end, but feel free to type them in because I know they take a little while to think about. So yeah, let's get started. First things first, we always got to have our disclaimer. So I'll let you read through that quickly, but futures trading does involve risk. So this is me planting on our farm here. I want to say this was October 21st or October 22nd. So this is planting soybeans here. This field is about 1,200 acres, somewhere in there. It's all one square, just one of our family's field there. So it was nice. I got to plant a little bit. So this just giving you an overview of where the soybeans are produced in the world. You can see that Brazil is number one here. About 38% of the soybeans produced in the world come from Brazil, and so the U.S. is a close second at 31%. But after that, Argentina is a distant third, and so beyond that, everyone else is a fairly insignificant soybean producer. So 87% of the soybeans produced in the world are coming from the Americas, and so it really comes down to these two countries, and everything else are pretty insignificant producers. I put this little video together. You can kind of get an idea of what's happened in the last 30 years in terms of soybean production between the United States and Brazil. You can see back in the 90s, kind of when I was in middle school, the U.S. had a pretty commanding lead in terms of their soybean production over Brazil. Brazil starts to grow in kind of that early 2000 period. The U.S. still maintains its lead and still growing, but not nearly at the kind of the speed that we see in Brazil. And so we kind of have that commodity boom take place in 2007, 2008, and that's when you see another major advance in Brazilian soybean production. And so they're starting to kind of close that lead, that gap between the U.S. and Brazil. But it's so they're getting close, but now it's not until about this, I think the 17-18 season, there you go, that Brazil surpasses the United States, and not only since then has maintained that lead, but continues to expand upon it. So this is where we're at now. This is in millions of tons, by the way, and so that's what we're projecting here for this year. So this kind of gives you an idea of where we're at right now in the growing season. So we're here in this part of December, and so we're just wrapping up the planting here in the Brazil soybeans and in the first crop of corn. Pretty soon we're going to be here in January, and so already in January you'll have some of the earlier planted soybeans begin harvesting. And so that harvest period is pretty long, from January to May. There's some place in Brazil that's harvesting soybeans. You're kind of in the first crop corn. You're in that growing, just general growing development period, and then the first crop of corn planting starts for the second crop of Brazilian corn will start to go in there in January. So this kind of gives you a rough idea. So here are these white areas. That's when that dry season for the most part occurs, and there's not much going on there for the for growing in the Mato Grosso and places like that. Just kind of give you a reminder of what's been going on with weather in Brazil. So they are going through still in La Nina phase. And what happens with La Nina in Brazil is, in general, you have the northern half of the country is much wetter, and the southern part of the country is much drier. And we're seeing that again this year so far. However, not to the extreme that we saw last year. Up to this point last year, that it was a lot drier, and the drought area was a lot wider in most of southern Brazil. So far, that drought's been limited to the southernmost state of Rio Grande do Sul, and then and it's actually a lot worse in Argentina. And so there might there's a lot of growing season left. And so that still could change. It does look like the La Nina is expected to fade out here going into January. But we never know for sure, right? But that's in general what we're expecting. So this shows you the rainfall accumulation in the last 90 days in Brazil, and I think is kind of representative of who's been getting the moisture and who has not. So you kind of see this is the state of Paraná, where they've had pretty heavy rainfalls in their crops, and especially their corn. Their first crop season corn is looking really good. But you can see here most of the green area all have adequate rainfall here to the north, and it's here in the south, especially the southern part of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, that has had much lower levels of moisture. And so that's kind of the general weather pattern that we're seeing. This shows you the surface soil moisture in Brazil and South America. You kind of see that there's plenty in the blue, plenty of excess water here. There were some dry spots here. This is mostly in Goiás, but I think they've gotten a lot of rains here recently and are projected to get some more here. But you can see who's really hurting the most is Argentina right here. This is kind of Cordoba is where their major production area is. So you can see it's very dry. And so it's kind of clipped here, part of Rio Grande do Sul, the southern part of Brazil. So this southernmost state is still a significant soybean producer. I think they produce about 14% of Brazil's total soybean crop. And so, but you can see here that this is Argentina is suffering. There is some going to be some yield damage from this. This is just kind of a summary of what CONAB is projecting for next season's crop, soybean and corn crop. So they're looking at 5.6 billion bushels for the soybeans. That's about 1 billion bushels more than the U.S. Crop was this season. And so they're also projecting 107 million acres, which is about a 4.5% increase from last year. And so we continue to see those acres increase and will surpass that of the United States. It's impressive to me that they've still maintained that growth. They've historically been growing at that 3 to 4%. And it's one thing we can do that 4% on 50 million acres, but they're still maintaining that 4% growth on 100 million acres. And so it starts to add up. And so it's another 6 million acres just from that. So looking at the corn, just under 5 billion bushels. So, still roughly a third of what it is in the United States, but it's still been growing dramatically. And that's on an area of 55 million acres. And as you might know, most of that's coming from the second crop, right? So we're in the growing season now, middle of the growing season of the first crop, which is not insignificant, but still it only makes up roughly a third or so, less than a third of the total corn production. And so what really matters is the second crop when it comes to Brazil, and that won't begin planting it until next month. And so it's still pretty premature, I think, to make a lot of estimates of what the Brazilian corn production is going to be. But the third crop is also very tiny as well, and fairly insignificant. This shows you the history of this Brazil soybean production. You can see there's a pretty clear upward trend in production history going back. So we're well, almost 5 times. It's grown by a factor of 5 in the last 22, 23 years, essentially. And so you can see here they got dinged a little bit last year by the drought. They lost about 20 million metric tons from that drought in the south last year, but they're projections for this year make up for that and close to 153. And I think that they're on track for that. I did kind of question, some of their, if they're still going to be able to produce some of the yields that they are, considering how fast that they're growing, and we'll get into that a little bit. So this shows the yield comparison between Brazil and the United States. One thing I would point out is, obviously the acreage has been expanding, and that's generally what people talk about is the acres are growing. But I think most of their production growth is actually coming from the yield. If you look back and you can see how much their yield has been growing. There's pretty clear upward trend, and they've actually surpassed the United States for average yield, and they're expecting to do that again for this year. They're actually targeting 52.5 bushels for this season, which would be a record. I think that's a little bit optimistic, in my opinion, just because a lot of the new land that they're bringing into production is maybe the fertility isn't quite much there, and also they've been cutting back a little bit on their fertilizer investments for the first time in many years, just because of the cost. They're cutting back on that. So I think not that they can't produce well. I think they're going to have a good year. However, they're also producing, they're getting excellent rainfall. And so I think the rainfall will, maybe make up for some of that if it continues the way it's going. And so for the most part, they're getting great rainfall in Mato Grosso and a lot of that center west region where it counts. And so you can see here last year, their yield dropped to 44.9, and that was from the drought. And so, but they're, the trend is still up. So looking at, you can kind of compare the difference between planted acres of soybeans between Brazil and the United States. And again, you see that clear uptrend, back in the year 2000, only 34 million acres, and now just in a span of 22 years, they're at 107 million acres. And, you look at the United States and it's just kind of flatlined here in the last, 8-9 years, the last decade, basically, that because we've kind of reached our peak acres overall. When they still have more land to expand in Brazil. And so they surpassed, I think that was the 18-19 season that they surpassed the United States. And so you're not seeing the same level of growth anymore in the United States that what they have in Brazil. This kind of shows you where the overall production level is, and kind of in that same time period that both U.S. and Brazil have been growing, but Brazil has been growing at a faster rate, and it overtook Brazil there in that 16-17 season. It looked like in terms of overall production, and I think that trend line will continue. This kind of shows you a breakdown of where the soybeans are produced in Brazil. And you can see that most of it's coming from that center west region. That's Mato Grosso do Sul, and Goiás. This is where most of the production and the growth is taking place. People always are concerned about the Amazon deforestation. Only 6% of Brazil's soybean production is coming from that Amazon basin, which is probably 6% more than what you'd like to see, but I thought it was important to point out that it's a relatively insignificant part of their overall production, and most of it's coming from the Cerrado region here. You can see here in the south, this is their traditional production area. It still makes up a significant 30%, but what you're seeing is a gradual shift north, where 5 years ago maybe this was 33% or 35%. And I think in the next, 5 to 10 years, this 30% will become 25%. So the shift is just moving north, and the center west is just eating more into the total amount of Brazil's production. In terms of breaking it down by state, you can see that Mato Grosso is still the largest producer by far, represents 27% of Brazil's total production. That Rio Grande do Sul, the state to the very south that I talked about, is a distant second, and kind of goes back and forth between them and Paraná. And so, they're still important, but and that's where all the drought is. And so, but most of the time, if you want to have an idea of how good a season Brazil is going to have, you want to look at what's going on in Mato Grosso, just because they're so large. I wanted to talk a little bit about the cost of production in Brazil, and this is the cost of production for soybeans in Mato Grosso. You kind of see last season they had an amazing year, just with their cost structure, and they averaged about 54 bushels per acre in that state. And so that would have given them roughly about $358 per acre. And these are numbers coming from IMEA, which is kind of a state production agency in the state of Mato Grosso. And so farmers are doing pretty well. They're more flush with cash than they have probably been in the last 10 years, or maybe in their entire history. Now next year they're still showing some good profitability. Kind of left the same, the yield the same, the price the same, but their costs have gone up exponentially, kind of, as we're used to seeing in the United States. And so with fertilizer and chemical, everybody wants a cut. And, and so even though revenue, yield and revenue stays the same, it's the costs that go up. And so $177 per acre, still historically a very good profit, but it's, not $358, but, I don't think you can complain about that. Still give you a 30% return on your capital invested into growing that crop. And so I think the point of that is just to show that they're still expecting a pretty good profitable season, assuming they can, hit those yield targets in Mato Grosso. I wanted to give a shout out here to the biodiesel production in Brazil, just because that's something that's been growing a lot as well. Brazil has a strong biodiesel industry, and it's been growing pretty much year over year for the last 10 years. And the last year it is going to pull back a little bit, but this is important just because the more biodiesel they produce in Brazil, the more soybeans they consume in Brazil, which means the less soybeans they need to export. And so if you're a US farmer, you want Brazil to be consuming more or producing more biodiesel in their country. And so you kind of see the growth that's been taking place there. Now they have established a biodiesel mandate in Brazil going back to 2005, and it's been going up, by a point or so every year. And for the most part, they've been following that. In the last year or two, they did take a step back. The previous president, Bolsonaro, decided to pull that back from B14 down to B10. And I think the thought process there was they thought it was cheaper to import more oil at that time, and so that's what they did. Now the incoming president takes over January 1st here in a couple of weeks, and he's already kind of announced that now we're going to go back to this original plan, which sees them going back to B15 already in March. And so in just a matter of a couple months here, 2.5 months, they're going to be back up to their stated goal of B15. And so they're going to be, expect them to see an increased consumption in biodiesel. This shows you kind of historical exports in Brazil for soybeans. You can see here that every year, as they've grown, produce more soybeans, they need to get rid of that. They need to export those soybeans, and they've been doing that. So they did fall off here last year a little bit because of the drought, but they're expecting, with this bigger crop this season to go back and set a new record, basically 92 million metric tons. The other thing I'd point out here is how dependent they are on China, kind of similar to how we are in the United States with China being our biggest buyer of soybeans. It's the same thing in Brazil. They're making up roughly 70% of their soybean purchases or their exports are going to China. And so if China slows down, that's going to have an impact on their market as well. And so, that's kind of what that looks like. So it's interesting. This is a picture I took. I showed it last year, just driving down the road in the middle of Mato Grosso. You see these grain storage facilities with these Chinese symbols. And, it's so important for China to be able to lock in this soybean supply that they're going directly to the source. They're actually, building their grain storage facilities there to be able to buy the soybeans directly from the farmer. So COFCO is China's state supplier of grain origination, and so it's just kind of interesting. It's something you really wouldn't see in the United States driving down a busy street in Iowa. But you see a lot of these facilities now, and so they're locking in their supply chain for soybeans and making sure they guarantee that supply. So this kind of shows you what's happened in the last 30 years with the global soybean export share between the U.S. and Brazil. You can see that when I was a young buck, Brazil or the United States had almost 2/3 of the global soybean market share, and Brazil was pretty distant, far away at 14%. And so now at as early as 2020, that's flip-flopped, and so Brazil makes up half of the global soybean exports, and the United States is down to almost 1/3. And so it's not a trend that I think we see changing anytime soon, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So let's focus on the corn and see what's happening with the corn. So last season, they got clipped a little bit as well with some dry weather in Mato Grosso, not near as much as the soybeans, but you can kind of see they planted 53 million acres of corn, and now they're projecting over 55 million acres. And so, the corn, it's a lot smaller than the U.S. crop. It's still, growing consistently year over year. Looking for signals on what we expect from next season's crop. I talked about how we haven't begun planting that second season crop yet. That won't start until January. However, we look to when the soybean crop gets planted, because if the soybean crop is planted on time, that generally means that the corn crop, the second crop of corn that follows it in Mato Grosso, is going to be planted on time. And that's a good indication that that crop is going to be put in the right conditions and have enough rainfall, because that's the biggest challenge. The weather doesn't change. They're not concerned about a frost or snowfall or anything like that. They're worried about the rainy season coming to the end prematurely and having enough time for that corn crop to grow. If they're going to produce a big crop, they're going to have to export more corn as well, because they pretty much are exporting all their excess, and they just keep enough for their own needs and domestically, and pretty much export the rest. And so I think that we are going to see an impact, some yield damage in Argentina from the dry weather. They've already been cutting some corn acres, but as I said, it's too early to say. You could get into February and there could be a dry period in February, and that could hurt the corn yields in Mato Grosso. But they haven't even planted the majority of the crop yet. So, but I think you are seeing some yield damage in Argentina that could affect the global corn prices. This kind of gives you a side-by-side comparison of where the major corn is produced and from different countries. You can kind of see here that Brazil's corn production has increased by 145% in the last 20 years and is responsible for about 7% of the global production. The U.S. of course is increased as well, but not at the same rate that they have. And so, there may come a time when that Brazilian corn production surpasses that of U.S. corn production, similar to the soybeans. And it may not be for a decade or 2 decades yet, but it's certainly long-term perspective. It's heading in that direction. This is just a nice chart that the FAS put together. Kind of shows you, I talked about how, in the green, this is the, take a look at the land area. This shows the land area. And yeah, it has gone up over this 22-year period. But look at the yield, see how the yield is changed dramatically. And so, as I talked about, everyone talks about, oh, they're expanding acres in Brazil. Yes, they are. But a lot of the overall corn output is actually coming from increased yield. And a lot of it's because of improved seed genetics. And I saw that in my time farming in Bahia, that in a 10-year window, yields, it seemed like doubled. And a lot of that was, from improved seed genetics that we had. And so it's kind of representative here on this graph. This shows you the evolution of the corn crop. You kind of see the comparison between the 3 crops. And so you have the first crop, and the second crop, and the third crop. And again, it used to be where the first crop of corn in the year, this is just 20 years ago. It's not all that long ago, made up, 75% of Brazil's corn output. And you kind of see that's stagnated to even dropped a little bit as we move forward here. Whereas the second crop of corn, kind of starting in that 11-12 season, really started to explode and take off. And so this is kind of where we're at now. You can see that it's gotten to the point where the second crop of corn was called safrinha, which means the little harvest. And because 20 years ago it was. And so that name is kind of stuck where they call it the safrinha, but it's the little crop, but it's actually become the predominant crop in Brazil. And you can see the third crop there. It doesn't amount to a whole bunch, but they're still tracking that. So you kind of see that it really comes down to the second crop of corn in Brazil. Corn production by state in Brazil, again, Mato Grosso is over 1/3 of the corn production in the country. And so if Mato Grosso has a bad crop, Brazil's going to have a bad crop. If Mato Grosso has a good crop, Brazil's going to have a good crop. And so Paraná is a distant second. I know right now, I think Paraná is their first crop of corn is looking very good. But so yeah, you can kind of see here that it takes the next 3 states combined to kind of equal what's going on in Mato Grosso in terms of corn production there. And so this gives you a good feel for where a lot of that corn concentration is happening. This is the first crop in Brazil. And so I'm kind of located right about here in this area of Minas Gerais. I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but you can see how it's pretty more heavily concentrated here in the south in this northeast region. And then here's the second crop. So you can see how it all shifts in the Mato Grosso and the Goiás and Mato Grosso do Sul. So here's the first crop, here's second crop, here's first crop, here's second crop. And so that's kind of what that looks like. But again, I want to talk about the exports for corn. And you kind of see that there's also an upward trend taking place there, that as the production in Brazil grows, they need to be able to export that. Looking at the 2022 season, we think we're obviously not quite done with 2022 yet, but we're going to probably not be able to take out the previous high of 44.9, but we're going to be pretty close coming in there at that 42. But for this next season, what they're projecting in terms of production, I think we will probably see a new export record in 2023, closer to that 50 million metric ton level. This is a big part of why Brazil is so successful with their exports right now. Because Brazil's cost of corn, FOB, is the cheapest place in the world right now. And so, at least amongst the major 3 suppliers. And so you kind of see here that the US has been flat here for a while. Argentinian corn just recently is become a little bit more expensive, but there's still a pretty big gap between the US and what's going on in Brazil. And so I think that's why in the second half of 2022, Brazil is the kind of the first choice for a lot of corn buyers. But as we get into January and February, you're going to see that fall off. Not because the price is going to get much cheaper, just because Brazil is going to run out of corn. They're pretty much going to export everything that they had, and then buyers are going to have no choice but to come back to the U.S. corn. And so I know everyone talks about how U.S. corn exports are down, but it's really not the main corn export season for that. I think as Brazil's crop continues to get bigger, it kind of creates a longer tail where you're seeing buyers stick around longer, buying more from Brazil, and that's kind of eating a little bit more and more into the U.S. corn export market. And I don't think the USDA maybe is taking that into account, at least not as much as they should be. And so I'm not saying that all U.S. corn exports going to, go back to meet expectations, but you are going to see them pick up here quite a bit in the first half of 2023. Another big, byproduct of all that corn is you're seeing an increase in corn ethanol. And I've talked about this for the last couple of years. And so you can see just in the last 4 years how corn ethanol is quadrupled in Brazil. Now it's compared it to the United States, it's still pretty insignificant. Brazil or the US is producing, around that 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol, and they're not quite 1 billion gallons yet. But the expectation is that they're going to see some pretty significant growth here year over year. And I don't know why that would change either. Now that how will that affect the U.S. ethanol market is through ethanol exports, because what's probably going to happen is a lot of that corn ethanol that's being produced in Mato Grosso and that center west region is going to be used domestically, and a lot of that sugarcane ethanol being produced in Sao Paulo, in the state of Sao Paulo, which is a lot closer to the port, could very well be exported. And you are seeing that with that's been the bread and butter of the U.S. Ethanol market in the last 10 years is the ethanol, is the exports. That's kind of what's kept them alive in those lean years when prices and margins have been depressed. And you can kind of see here how exports really exploded here from that 2013 to 2018 period. Well, now starting in 2017, you're starting to see Brazil's ethanol exports increase as U.S. ethanol exports are decreasing. And so they're essentially starting to eat into that market. And Brazil's pulled back here in the ethanol exports, but U.S. ethanol exports continue to fall as well. And so it certainly looks like as time comes together, these two numbers will come together. U.S. exports could be depressed as Brazil ethanol exports continue to increase. And so I think that's one of the fallouts of having a bigger Brazilian crop means more corn ethanol being produced, which means more Brazilian corn ethanol being exported, or ethanol in general. So this is one of the reasons for that. This is one of the first large-scale pure corn ethanol plants in Brazil. This is in the town of Lucas do Rio Verde. And oddly enough, this plant is, I think, only like 20% Brazilian owned and 80% American owned, if I'm not mistaken. And they already have 3 of these plants, and so just in this one investment company. And so there's several other investment companies that are building ethanol plants, and so that's where you're seeing a lot of that growth. So they're actually using a lot of the same American technology in plants in the U.S. They're adopting that and utilizing that in Brazil in these plants. And so I don't think the growth is going to happen quite as hard and fast as we saw in the United States back in the kind of that early 2000 period. But I still think you're going to see kind of nice, steady upward growth. And part of that's just because of the liquidity and access to financing. It seems, in the US, we're able to get financing together to buy those shares, and a lot quicker than I think a lot of the Brazilians and these companies are. The other thing too is, I remember one ethanol plant that was built near St. Ansgar, Iowa at the time. And if you've ever been to St. Ansgar, it's just a nice little small rural community in the middle of Iowa. And you wouldn't think there was anything special about it, but they raised something crazy like $60 million in 2 days. I remember when they announced it to build an ethanol plant. And so there's a lot of money can come together to build these plants real quickly in the United States. And it's not quite that easy in Brazil. It's just the liquidity and putting the money together takes a lot longer to do. So that's my main reason why I think you're not going to quite see the explosion as quick and fast in Brazil, but it is coming, it's happening, and it's just going to be a little bit slower pace to get there. So I'm going to get something to drink. So, when I would first came to Brazil, I'd tell Brazilians, well, because they have a long history of producing ethanol, but it's all from sugarcane. And I would say, well, our ethanol is made from corn, and they'd kind of roll their eyes and say, oh no, the sugarcane is way better. It's way better. And I think they're saying now that that's not necessarily the case. Not that sugarcane is bad, but there are a lot of advantages to producing ethanol from corn over sugarcane. One of those, as you kind of see here, is that you can store that corn for long periods of time. You can store it for a year or more, even if you want it. Where you can't do that with sugarcane. It has to be processed within 3 days of being harvested. Well, the problem with that is then you have to source it from very nearby where the plant is, which then means that a lot of the sugar mills in the South they end up starting to buy or rent a lot of the land around them to guarantee their supply, because they can't just shut down because, we didn't want to go an extra 5 miles down the road to get more sugarcane. And so that kind of inflates prices, and it's a massive investment. Now imagine that at a U.S. corn ethanol plant, if they started buying up or renting all the land around the plant just to make sure they had enough corn. It probably wouldn't go over very well with a lot of the farmers, and it'd probably inflate a lot of the land and rental prices. But that's essentially what's happened with sugarcane. And so, so that's one of the advantages why it makes sense, to having corn ethanol. So let's switch over and talk about the exchange rate a little bit. The exchange rate is something that we don't have to think about too much in the United States, but it is something that a Brazilian farmer has to think about. This kind of shows you where, as COVID began here, their exchange rate really began to devalue because their currency weakened because they started to shut down a lot of things, and it hurt their economy. They were providing a lot of stimulus similar to what we did in the United States, and it kind of jumped around back and forth for a while. Inflation started to take off, and they started raising interest rates. And that helps here kind of bring things back under control for a little while. I think Brazil increased it's the quickest amount their interest rates, I think, about any country in the world. They went from like 2% up to 14% in a year, a little over a year. And so, in the US, we're all complaining about our 6%, home mortgages, and in Brazil, their interest rates are like 14%. And so, but it did work. Their inflation has started to come back down. It's about 7%. And so it's just barely ahead of where it's at in the United States, actually. So I think for maybe the first time in modern history, the Brazilians like to tell me how, their inflation is less than that in the United States. And, it's like less than 1%, but, and it's also maybe the first time in history that's happened. But technically, it's for a period of a few months. That's true. So we'll see how that plays out, though. But this is important to a Brazilian farmer because everything is dollarized. The soybeans are dollarized, and so if their currency strengthens, then that means they get less local currency, they get less Brazilian reals for their dollar. And if currency weakens, they actually get more Brazilian reals. And so I think that's a risk that they have, that they want to, they actually would be okay with the currency stabilizing or getting weaker. It would probably pinch their margins a little bit if the currency strengthened, because a lot of their debt is dollarized. So this chart is maybe a little bit outdated, but I just like to show it. It shows where most of the grain flow is coming out of Brazil and the soybeans. And you kind of see this bigger arrow here is where most of the grain is still flowing through Santos. However, what's been changing in the last 10 years is a lot of the grain is beginning to flow to the Amazon basin here and these ports in Santarém and Manaus. And I think now they're up to as much as 30% of the grain in Mato Grosso is going out through the Amazon now. And, 10 years ago or so, it was close to zero. It's a very insignificant amount. And so that's something that I think has helped a lot. You're going to see that continue to grow because they have been improving the port infrastructure in that Amazon region. They've been improving it in Santos as well. But it's cheaper to send it up here just because it's closer. And not near as congested maybe as what it is coming in through Sao Paulo. And so there are some infrastructure improvements there that make their transport costs a little bit cheaper. The deforestation issue has been a hot button issue in Brazil. And so I just wanted to point this out quickly, that a lot of that, this is the ecosystem broken down in Brazil. And just reading things and hearing people talk, I feel like it's important to clarify that the entire country of Brazil is not the Amazon rainforest, right? It's a big part of the country, but this is what the Amazon is located to. And this kind of bluish purple hue, I don't know, whatever you call that, that's referred to as the Cerrado. And that's actually where most of your production growth has come from. Now it's encroaching a little bit on this kind of Amazon basin and coming up here in the Mato Grosso a little bit more, but most of your growth is coming from this region here. And I guess I thought that was important just because, there's a lot of misinformation out there on the deforestation issue and where that growth is coming from. And so again, I'm kind of located right in this area. So I'm a long ways from the Amazon in this region. So this is shows you the deforestation rate in the Amazon and what's going to happen. And so this is Lula is President Lula is a pretty divisive character in Brazil. I don't know that I have a lot of great things to say about him. However, he did have a pretty good environmental track record, and it's pretty hard to argue this. And so you kind of see that the deforestation rate during his presidential tenure came down quite a bit, and it kind of bottomed out here when a couple other people became president. And now, under Bolsonaro, who's the outgoing president, his term ends here this month. It started to ratchet up. And so I think a lot of Bolsonaro was a more vocal proponent of developing the Amazon region, and seemed unabashed about protecting kind of the natural resources there, which you can imagine went over like a lead balloon with a lot of the environmental community, international environmental community. And so Lula, the way it works in Brazil, Lula served 2 terms, and then you have to take a break and let someone else become president, and then you can come back and run again. And that's what Lula did that. And he actually spent almost 2 years in prison, by the way, which we won't get into that. But so Lula was president for 2 terms here. And now he ran again and won, and is going to be coming back as president. And despite kind of his shady criminal history, I think a lot of the environmental community is very much looking forward to having Lula come back as president again, simply because they're just looking at the deforestation rates and how he was able to bring those down. And he's already been vocal about that, hey, you bring me back as president, I'm I'm going to take care of this illegal deforestation that's going on in Brazil. And so that's why he's actually probably more popular outside of Brazil than maybe in Brazil. But so we are next month I'll be in Mato Grosso. We're hosting a group of 20 Americans and actually a couple of Canadians that are coming to Brazil. And so this is our group from 2020, just a couple months before COVID started. We had a group that visited our farm here in Minas, then went to Mato Grosso and then on to Rio. And so it is a parent meeting with a lot of the farmers that they're very much aware of their growth in as a country and in agriculture, and they're consider themselves kind of the new world supplier of food production. And so it is interesting and kind of impressive to see all that they've done in a lot of these large farms in Brazil. And so we're going to get a kind of a hands-on look at what the soybean crop looks like in Mato Grosso, and probably see some of the corn planting taking place as well there in the middle of January. So I'm kind of wrapping up here, and so I'll get to see if you have any questions, but wrapping up just some of the positive factors that we see with the crop right now. For the most part, most regions are getting excellent rainfall, and again, that can change yet, but we don't see too much in the long-term forecast for that to change. The inflation is down to 7% already, and so their economic situation is getting slightly better. Their exports are strong, and I think you're going to see them continue to set new export records, especially if they're going to have these big crops. They're looking at China and their economy probably as much as they are in the United States, just because they buy a lot of their soybeans. So if their hog producers are making money, that means they're going to want to keep buying soybeans, and they're looking at how China's economy is, if it's going to open back up from COVID and kind of facilitate the demand for more grain. Then of course their biodiesel and their ethanol production is, I think, going to continue to increase. The trend there is pretty clear. And some of the negative factors, the input costs have similar to the United States, have really taken off, exploded. To the point where for the first time in, 20 years or maybe ever, that some of the fertilizer consumption has actually gone down. And I think that's, despite acres going up. And so I think farmers are just saying, enough is enough. I got to cut back some places. But I talked a little bit about the president there, and his they're just coming off of a very divisive presidential election, and so I think there's expecting there to be a lot of gridlock in Congress, and so that usually means not a lot gets done. So we talked about the currency and how that could pinch farmers here in Brazil if the currency strengthens, and a lot of that it could strengthen if their economy gets back on track following COVID. But there's a lot of obstacles that they have to kind of work through. So their interest rates are high at 14%. If that was in the United States, people would be losing their minds. But historically, long-term historically, if you look at 20 years out or 30 years out, 14% really isn't all that bad. For most of my farming time in Brazil, 12% was normal, and so 14% is really not all that bad historically, in my opinion. But farmers are kind of behind in their sales here in Brazil, and so I think they need to pick up those sales here pretty quick, because their harvest is right around the corner. And so once that harvest kind of glut hits the market, I think it's going to weigh on the prices here in Brazil. So I think that's all I have for you. Let me get to some of the questions, and I should remind everyone that I don't know if you get the Comstock report, but I do contribute to that to the Comstock report every Wednesday, and so if you're interested, you can subscribe to that on our website at comstock.com. So we are going to be going to the corn ethanol plant in Mato Grosso, by the way, that very one. that I had in that picture. We're going to be going there in January, so we'll be able to see that. One question is transportation infrastructure still a limiting factor for continued expansion into the Cerrados region, or has that faded as a problem for them? Obviously, everybody likes nice roads. You can drive faster, it reduces the cost, but I suppose it is technically a limiting factor, but not that much. Everyone complains about it, but they still get the crop out and they get the job done. So it can make your crop and your cost of production more expensive. But I haven't really seen it. I mean, no one said, oh boy, I'm not going to grow here or do this or that because, I don't want to drive that extra hour down a dirt road or whatever. And so I think I've seen very little improvements in road infrastructure and in waterways and railroads. The only place that you can point to where I've seen a lot of improvement in infrastructure is at the ports. And there's a reason for that is because they got to get the crop out of the country. If they don't get the crop out of the country, prices are going to plummet and they're going to have a mess, and it's going to create a lot of economic hardship on farmers. And so we've seen major improvements in port capacity, and you're going to continue to see that, as I talked about, especially in in the Amazon region. And they're always making improvements. It seems like you always see some announcement someplace that they say, oh, we expanded this at this port and that, but that's been a big help. A lot of these guys, I mean, they whatever they got today, it's a heck of a lot better than they started 30, 40 years ago. And so they were able to get it done then. And so I don't see it being as a major limiting factor for the most part. But so yeah, any other final comments? I think that's all I have for you. So someone asked a question here: when can we start getting a pulse on the safrinha corn production? Maybe. I mean, they're going to start planting it in January, and so you're gonna look at see in January how the planting is going to go. But they're going to be planting a lot of that into kind of late February, and so so you're going to be following that planting period for quite a while yet, and so there's a long time, and so to really have a strong idea, probably got to get closer to March, I suppose, you can really start making concrete estimates of what it's that are accurate, I should say. But as I kind of talked about, the fact that they're planning, it looks like they're going to plant on time, I think is a big argument that the crop is going to be pretty good and increase the probability of a large crop. Just because that's what seemed to hurt them the last couple years the most. The soybean crop went in later, which means the corn crop that follows it goes in later, and so that they run out of rainfall, they run out of the rainy season, and that's what hurts it. And so, I think just the fact that I think they got the wind at their back is how I put it. That the second crop is going to be pretty large. Someone asked, are big grain companies investing in the Amazon? Well, I don't know that there's in the Amazon, so to say, probably not as much. I think they're building ports. I think some of those the big grain companies have port facilities some way or another up there. There's a lot of infrastructure and receiving stations in Mato Grosso from a lot of the big international grain merchants. No, I don't think they're just building big grain processing plants in the Amazon or anything like that. I think there's a lot of political and environmental pressure for them to stay out of there, and not just stay out of there, but not buy from farmers that are in those areas. And so I think that there's an uphill battle from farmers that want to be doing things that that they shouldn't be doing, that, trying to clear land illegally and things like that. That being said, it's still hard sometimes to track where that grain is coming from, right? If someone shows up with a truck full of soybeans, at a plant and says, yeah, I'm so and so, and I'm from, this farm in Goiás or whatever, it can be hard for them to be able to trace that. They don't know, if it came from the Amazon or someplace it shouldn't be coming. And so I think that's the challenge that they have is it's easier to say that, okay, we're going to quit buying soybeans from illegally deforested land area. But it all looks the same, obviously, when it's harvested. How do you know where it came from? And so that's the challenge that those companies have. I think they're getting a lot of pressure from their shareholders. Normally I would say, okay, do these companies really care? But I think a lot of their shareholders care, and so they're putting pressure on the boards and the CEOs of these companies to do what they can to avoid buying from these areas. And so I do think that in general they are trying to do what they can, but it's not 100%, bulletproof vest or whatever to be able to guarantee that they're not gonna make a mistake and buy from someplace they shouldn't. So, all right, well, I think thank you everyone. We got a couple more here. What is the most profitable, soybeans, cotton, or corn? Well, I think in my experience, on paper, the cotton is probably the most profitable per acre, but it requires a lot more investment. It requires specialized equipment. It requires a cotton gin, to be able to produce it at all. And so I think the soybeans are just a lot easier, and it's easier to sell, it's easier to manage, and cheaper. And so that's why everybody plants soybeans, right? The corn in Mato Grosso, depends where you're at too, in each state. The corn in Mato Grosso, I wouldn't say is a huge money maker. I would look at the corn, that big corn crop, as more of a rotational crop. They're planting that corn. If they can make money, they're not doing it to lose money, but just planting the corn and breaking even is still worth it to them, because then it's a rotational crop. Then they can no-till soybeans into that in the next year, and it'll give them a 5 or 10 bushel per acre boost in their soybeans. That's how I think a lot of the farmers there look at it, is I'm going to plant this corn, and be great if I could make a little bit of money, but even if I break even, it's still worth doing, because I'm going to make it up on my soybean crop that follows it, because I'm rotating on soybeans following corn, and so that'll give me a little bit better yield boost. And so but I think, cotton still probably has more profit potential, but it's also I can say from experience, it can really revenue can go up and down dramatically. And are the corn ethanol plants sequestering CO2? To my knowledge, no, they are not. They aren't doing that. I haven't heard of any plans to do that right now. And so I think if that were to happen, that'd be a long ways off. The one thing that they are doing that environmentally might give them an edge is they aren't using any natural gas to power these plants. They're using eucalyptus trees to power the plants. And so I should say renewable trees to power these plants. And so that kind of gives them a environmental edge and lowers their carbon footprint. They aren't using natural gas to power those plants. And it may be it's a lot easier to just hook up to a natural gas pipeline, and there you go. Whereas they're growing and buying and shipping I don't know how many millions of metric tons of trees, of wood chips, basically, to power these plants, but it's a renewable form of energy. And so I think that gives them a very low environmental footprint, much less than a typical plant in the United States, actually. However, with these proposed pipelines in carbon pipelines in the United States. I think that'll change those carbon pipelines. I think that's the main reason to do those in the United States, is it'll reduce the carbon footprint, or they all have I guess carbon ratings for how much they're emitting, and it'll reduce that to the point where it'll be on par. And so, because what's you're actually seeing happen is, because the ethanol carbon rating for Brazilian ethanol is much less in Brazil. Places like California will buy ethanol from Brazil, but they won't buy ethanol produced in Iowa, which seems insane, but that's what you're seeing a lot of times, and just because of that. So I think that's why I think those carbon pipelines make sense, just because they'll make our ethanol more competitive in other parts of the world, like in California and Europe and places like that. I don't have any good numbers. Someone asked about the cheaper freight going out of the Amazon River. I don't have any good numbers off to that. That's probably something I gotta take a look at for next year, and see how much cheaper that is going out of the Amazon River versus Santos. But so I'm going to owe you a response there for maybe next year. So someone asked, our soybean acres, as soy acres are increasing, what crops are shrinking? It's most everything else. It's probably the cotton, it's sugarcane, it's rice, it's maybe wheat, it's edible beans, almost everything else. And so it's a little different from in the US, right? For soybeans to go up, corn has to come down. For corn to go up, soybeans have to come down. It seems like, there's a strong competition there, but that's not the same in Brazil. It's the soybeans are the main crop, and they keep growing, and the corn is kind of following on the coattails of those soybeans, because they're, especially a lot of it's being double cropped. So they plant that soybeans. Well, that just means then they can double crop that much more. It doesn't, that second crop of corn isn't taking away from those soybean acres. And so, yeah, so it's you're seeing that this year. That's a lot of, I think, people, maybe even coffee in some situations, reducing some coffee and some sugarcane, and I know rice, especially in the South. I think there was a lot of rice and wheat that went to soybean acres. So is there much trend back to non-GMO soybeans? I don't think so. I think the Brazilian farmers like their technology traits. Their Intacta is a very popular variety here, or seed technology that I think, I don't know what percent is, it might be 70, 80, 90% of farmers use that in a lot of their varieties. And it's kind of an insect resistant variety. And that's something that it's maybe a disadvantage that Brazilians have, and is that because it's warm year round. They don't have that winter. In the United States, we have that winter that comes and kills everything. People, I looked at the forecast, and this weekend is going to be really cold in the U.S. Right? It's going to be like 20 below in some areas, and so you're going to be swearing under your breath. However, that's going to kill off a lot of things, and they don't have that in Brazil. And so it's basically a greenhouse year round, and it just, a lot of the insects and disease kind of festers, and so they have that. They have a much higher fungicide, insecticide cost to plant their fields here than they do in the United States. And so I think that's why a lot of the farmers rely on those GMO soybeans pretty heavily. And that's just one example. There's other examples, but they're actually coming out with I've written about this, they're coming out with the second generation Intacta insect resistant varieties. And I don't even know if that's really widely available in the United States, but it just kind of shows you how it used to be all the R&D for these companies was done in the United States and then kind of exported to other countries. And now it's all being done in Brazil. And then they'll see if they want to export it to the United States and stuff in places like that. So But yeah, that's kind of where we're at. So, well, it looks like got through most of the questions. So thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, give us a call at 712-227-1110. And if you like what you heard today, feel free to subscribe to our report at Comstock.com, where we have a lot more information there every week. So thank you guys and have a nice day.